Good morning, everybody. I welcome you all to today's CSM. I welcome the esteemed faculty, Director Sir, Dean Sir, to this today's CSM. And there are two presentations today. One from Surgery Department, Unit E, which Dr. Divya would be presenting. And Dr. Satyen Kumar and myself, we would be moderating the case. And the second presentation would be from medicine, and Dr. Ankita Devangan would be presenting that case, and Dr. Nilesh and Dr. Jitendra would be moderating the case. So now I request Dr. Divya GR3 from Surgery Unity to present the case.
Thank you, ma'am. Good morning to all the respective teachers. Today I am going to present a case of uncommon cause of pain in the lower abdomen and pain from Unit E, Department of General Surgery, IMS BHU. A student aged 23 from Saharsa, Bihar came to surgery OPD with chief complaints of pain in the lower abdomen and back, which was on and off from 1 year, and constipation for 1 year. Pain in the lower abdomen and back was insidious in onset, intermittent. It was mild in intensity, dull aching in nature, not radiating to lower limb, and it was relieved on oral analgesics. There was no history of bleeding per rectum, melena, spurious diarrhea, painful defecation, urinary complaints, headache while defecation, bone pain, jaundice, hematemesis, or abdominal distension. In past history, patient was non-diabetic, non-hypertensive. There was no history of tuberculosis or contact with tuberculosis patients or ATT intake in the past. No history of previous surgical intervention and no history of previous hospitalization. Patient was on mixed diet. His sleep was unaltered. There was no history of alcohol consumption or smoking, and family history was non-contributory. On general physical examination, patient was examined in well-lit room in supine position with adequate exposure after taking informed consent. Patient was conscious, alert, cooperative, and well-oriented to time, place, and person at the time of examination. His performance status was 90 by Karnofsky performance scale. Hydration status was normal, and his BMI was 19.2 kg per meter square. Patient was afebrile during the examination. His pulse was 76 beats per minute. Blood pressure was 122 by 74 millimeter of mercury. Respiratory rate was 14 cycles per minute. There was no pallor, icterus, cyanosis, clubbing, pedal edema, or generalized lymphadenopathy. On abdominal examination, on inspection, abdomen was flat in contour. Umbilicus was central in position and inverted. No dilated veins, visible pulsation, or peristalsis seen. All quadrants moving proportionately with respiration. Hernial orifices were normal. External genitalia were normal on inspection. No renal angle fullness seen. On palpation, abdomen was soft, non-tender. No organomegaly or lump was palpable. Hernial orifices and external genitalia was normal. On percussion, liver dullness present in fifth intercostal space in mid-clavicular line. Liver span was 12 centimeter, which was normal. No evidence of free fluid in the abdomen. On auscultation, normal bowel sound was heard. On DRE, normal anal tone was present. A smooth bulge felt at the posterior wall of rectum, 1.5 centimeter from anal verge. Upper limit of bulge cannot be reached. Laterally, it was seen up to half of the circumference of rectal lumen, which was non-tender, cystic in consistency. Rectal mucosa was smooth and free. Fecal staining was present, but no blood stain. On proctoscopy, a smooth bulge seen at the posterior wall of rectum, while the rectal mucosa was smooth and healthy. Perineal area was normal, back and spine was normal. Systemic examination, cardiovascular system, S1 and S2 was normal, no added sounds heard. Respiratory system and central nervous system were within normal limits. So based on the history and clinical examination, my summary is a 23-year male with pain in lower abdomen and back and constipation for 1 year with no bleeding per rectum. On digital rectal examination, a smooth bulge present in the posterior wall of rectum, 1.5 centimeter from anal verge. Upper limit of bulge cannot be reached. Rectal mucosa was smooth and free. Based on this finding, my diagnosis is retrorectal tumor. It could be developmental cyst. In the developmental cyst, it could be dermoid cyst or the rectal duplication cyst, which can be defined by pathological examination, and the mature cystic teratoma. These are the features. We can see the dermoid cyst, which is more common in the pediatric age group, while the mature cystic teratoma and even the rectal duplication cyst, which is more common in the children age group. Gender-wise, all three diagnoses is more prevalent in the female compared to male. Then salient features in dermoid cyst, usually it is a unilocular cyst with skin appendages with post-anal dimple. While in mature cystic teratoma, it is a unilocular cyst may contain the solid component. While the rectal duplication cyst, it is usually multilobular appearance with multiple satellite lesion. Rectal mucosa defect may be present. Coming to risk of malignancy, dermoid cyst is a benign cyst, while the mature cystic teratoma, if the solid component is present, there is high chance of malignancy. Rectal duplication cyst is also benign, but risk of malignant degeneration is present. Next radiology part will be discussed by Dr. Manish from Department of Radiodiagnosis.
Good morning, everyone. Patient came with a USG showing a well-defined thin wall, regular margin cystic lesion, measuring approx 9.8 into 8 centimeter, having no internal solid component, debris or septations, located posterior to urinary bladder, prostate, in close relation to posterior rectal wall, giving the possibility of rectal duplication cyst, for which CCT was advised. CCT lower abdomen, mid-sag and axial view show the well-defined thin wall, regular margin cystic lesion having no solid component, internal septation, fat, calcification, measuring approx 9.7 into 9.8 into 7.4 centimeter, located in pre-sacral space extending from S2 to coccyx. The lesion is displacing rectum and bladder anteriorly with maintained fat plane. Posteriorly, it is closely abutting sacrum with no obvious bony defect or destruction. Features are suggestive of benign retrorectal cystic lesion with the differentials of tail gut duplication cyst, purely cystic teratoma. Thank you.
Thank you, Manish. We have done the biochemical investigation for this patient. By keeping the diagnosis of teratoma in mind, we have advised tumor marker. So beta HCG, alpha fetoprotein, and lactate dehydrogenase was advised, which was within normal limit. And his all biochemical parameters like hemogram, liver function test, and kidney function test were within normal limit. With the diagnosis of mature cystic teratoma and enteric, that is tail gut cyst in mind, we have planned for excision of the cyst. Under spinal anesthesia in supine position, midline vertical infraumbilical incision was given. Rectum and bladder was pushed anteriorly. Bilateral ureter was identified. Cyst size was around 9 into 8 centimeter. Posterior wall of cyst was thin, but anterior wall was thick and densely adhered to the posterior wall of rectum. Presacral dissection was done between presacral fascia and cyst up to the coccyx. Cyst wall was dissected from posterior wall of rectum, during which cyst was ruptured accidentally. Around 150 to 200 ml of serous fluid was drained, and it was sent for routine microscopy and cytology. Cyst wall was excised, hemostasis secured, suction drain placed. In post-operative course, on post-operative day 1, patient vitals was stable. On chest examination, bilateral equal air entry was present with no added sounds. Per abdomen was soft and non-tender. His input was 2700 ml while output was 1700 ml. Drain output was 500 ml serosanguinous. On post-operative day 1, his hemoglobin was 11.7 gram per deciliter. Total count was 11,890. Differential counts were also within normal limit. Platelet was 1.2 lakh per millimeter of cube. Total protein was 7.8, albumin was 3.8, and urea creat was within normal limit. Cyst fluid cytology, which aimed to be negative for malignant cells, and cyst fluid, which was sent for routine and microscopy. This was the report. Color was light yellow. Sugar was 79.1 milligram of deciliter. Protein was 0.41 gram per deciliter. Total number of cells was 64 per cubic millimeter, and which was predominantly neutrophils, 74%, and lymphocytes were 25%. In necrotic materials, smudge cells were present. During the post-operative day 2 to day 5, patient was doing well, except persistent increased drain output. We can see on the post-operative day 2, 450 ml of drain output was there, which was serosanguinous, while on day 3, 500 ml, but it turned to be serous in nature. In day 4, 400 ml serous in nature, and day 5, it was 550 ml in serous. On post-operative day 3, due to persistent increased drain output, we have taken the urologic consultation, and from the urology, advice was given for drain fluid urea and creatinine. Drain fluid urea came to be 9.5 milligram per deciliter, and drain fluid creatinine was 0.6 milligram per deciliter, which was within normal limit. During post-operative day 6 to day 9, due to persistent increased drain output, patient has been advised for tablet lesilectron, 1 tablet once in a day from post-operative day 6 onwards. We can see in the post-operative day 6, his drain output was 500 ml serous. In day 7, 350 ml serous. Day 8, it was 200 ml serous, while on day 9, it was 200 ml serous. On post-operative day 10, patient was discharged on drain with the advice of tablet lesilectron, 1 tablet once in a day. After 1 week of discharge, patient came for follow-up. During this follow-up, patient was stable, but his drain output in last 24 hours was 450 ml serous. Except this, patient was not having any other complaints. During this visit, patient has been advised for tablet lesilectron, 1 tablet twice in a day to continue. Again, after 2 weeks of discharge, patient came for another follow-up. During this time, 24-hour drain output was 200 ml serous, which was again high. So again, we have taken the urology consultation, and from the urology, it has been advised for tablet pyridium 200 milligram, 1 tablet 3 times in a day, and patient has been monitored for 24 hours. Following which, urine color changed to orange, but drain fluid color did not change, and it remains serous. Keeping that in mind, and drain output following gradually decreased to less than 100 ml serous in nature and was removed on post-operative day 24. This microscopic histopathological surgical specimen will be discussed by Dr. Paramita Palma.
Good morning, everyone. So, with the received cystic tissue pieces, as we can see here, it appears somewhat multiloculated, and it is surrounded by a smooth muscle layer. But the muscle layer is not as organized like that of muscularis propria, which we see in gut. So that's why it rules out a duplication cyst. On higher power, when we see into the cyst lining, we can see that it is lined by somewhat cuboidal epithelium. There's another photomicrograph which shows some muscle bundles abutting the cyst lining, and also the cyst wall showed some nerve bundles. So squamous epithelium or keratin debris was not seen, so it rules out an epidermoid cyst. Adnexal structures were not seen, so it rules out a dermoid cyst. And also, as the muscle layer is not as well organized as seen in the gut, so it rules out a duplication cyst. So based on above findings, the features are suggestive of a tail gut cyst, which is also called as a retrorectal cyst hematoma. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Again, on the post-operative day 29, patient came for follow-up. Patient was doing well. No fresh complaints was given by patient. On examination, wound was healthy and no discharge was seen. Coming to discussion, the tail gut cyst, also known as cystic hematoma, being one of the rare congenital malformation present in the presacral space, is a remnant of the postnatal part of the hindgut. As the embryo starts to fold inward during the 4th week of gestation to enclose the future gut, the cloacal membrane, it comes to lie ventral and encloses the caudal portion that is distal to the eventual hindgut is called tail gut. The tail gut usually regresses by 6th week of gestation, but if mucus secreting remnants fails to regress, a tail gut cyst is formed. It can present at any age, although they have usually appeared between the age of 30 to 60. Strong predominance is seen in female. The female to male ratio is 5:1. The majority of cysts are asymptomatic and often missed on digital rectal examination due to low tension in the cyst. Compression of the nearby structures, organs can cause an array of symptoms, including urological symptoms, sciatica, and defecation difficulties. Imaging modalities such as CT scan and MRI are the cornerstone in the diagnosing of presacral masses. On MRI, a tail gut cyst typically demonstrates a low signal intensity on T1 weighted images and high signal intensity on T2 weighted images, though it may vary according to the content. Excision of the retrorectal tumor is treatment option for symptomatic as well as for asymptomatic patients due to risk of complications like possibility of malignancy or future malignant transformation, infection, defecation difficulties, or potential dystocia in females. Approaches that can be used for surgery are anterior approach, posterior approach, or the combined approach. Anterior approach assures visualization of the important structures and thus a better oncological resection for cases with suspected malignancy. For small, low-lying, non-infected cases, we can go for posterior approach, although these result in a higher risk of pelvic infections. Risk of malignant transformation in a tail gut cyst is reported in as many as 13% of the cases. Thank you.
So that was the presentation from surgery department. So as I see, there is one question from Dr. Vivek Shrivastava in the chat box. So Dr. Vivek can unmute himself and ask, although Dr. Satyen has answered the question, but he may unmute himself. Dr. Vivek Shrivastava.
Hello.
Yes, Vivek, you may ask the question.
Yes. What was the cause of that increased serious bleed?
So I think, as the final histopathological diagnosis came to be a tail gut cyst, and this tail gut cysts are derived from tail gut remnants, which are the precursors of the GIT system. So the epithelium, the mucus secreting epithelium may be present, and that could be the cause of the increased or persistent drain. And the other thing we were keeping in mind, as you must have seen in the presentation, to rule out whether, although the ureters were delineated and seen properly, but then we thought, just to rule out if it was urine or not, we took urology consultation and did the necessary workup. And third thing which came to our mind was it could be excessive peritoneal fluid. So these were the three things which could be the cause. So one by one they were ruled out, and finally what we thought was probably it could be a mucus secreting from because of the columnar, because of the final diagnosis of a tail gut cyst. And I would also invite Dr. Sameer Trivedi. Dr. Sameer Trivedi, are you there? So he can add to.
Yes, Dr. Seema. Am I audible?
Yes, Dr. Sameer. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. So, this is a fairly common scenario that we see in the post-operative period. The drainage is much higher than expected and persists for a long time. So, the two most common culprits are urine and lymph. In this case, there was no lymphatic dissection performed of any kind, so the possibility of lymphatic drainage was quite less. Urinary drainage was a possibility because the dissection was quite close to the ureters and the bladder. So the first thing that we do when we suspect that urine might be coming through the drain is to get a analysis of the fluid for creatinine done. And normally if it is significantly high, roughly about 10:1 ratio, so if the serum creatinine is 1, then the fluid creatinine level should be around 10 if it is urine. In this case, it was almost exactly the same as the serum creatinine, so the possibility of urine coming in the drain fluid was practically ruled out. However, even if it persists for a long time, the other a very basic way of determining whether it's urine is to give some kind of coloring agent to the patient which colors the urine. Additionally, it has been described that intravenous methylene blue should be given, but it is rare to find the intravenous methylene blue agent for application. So we usually give oral pyridium, which is phenazopyridine, and that turns the urine orangish. So you can ask the patient to take oral tablets and then compare the color of the urine to the drain, which in this case again showed that it was not a urine. And the third possibility could be the peritoneal fluid, which can sometimes be coming out to the drain for a long time, especially if the patient has got hypoproteinemia or is malnourished. So sometimes the peritoneal fluid keeps on coming for a long time. So that could have been another possibility. And like Dr. Seema said, since this was a secretory cyst and part of the wall was still left behind during the dissection, so that could have produced the fluid continuously. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sami. So now we have another question from Dr. Vaibhav Pandey. Dr. Vaibhav, kindly unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you, ma'am. Very nicely worked up and honest presentation of case. Congratulations, everybody. I want to ask, you people are doing all advanced laparoscopic surgeries. Did you consider at any time that you should approach this case laparoscopically, as it was benign and very well defined area?
Yes. Yes. Vaibhav, good morning.
Sir.
Hello.
Good morning, sir.
Vaibhav, there's as Dr. Divya already told, that this can be approaches by anterior, and anterior approach can be done by the laparoscopy or by open methodology. So if the expertise is available, we can proceed for the laparoscopy. Although in our case, we go for the open approach.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Dr. Seema, I have a question. Professor Ashok Kumar.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, please.
Okay, so this patient presented with constipation for last 1 year.
Yes, sir.
So what led to constipation? It was obstruction by the cyst, which led to constipation. And then the second related question is, were the fecal palpable in this case?
Right, sir. Thank you for your valid questions.
The third comment is, my third comment is, the resident should have supported her statements by giving appropriate references. Only at the fag end, she gave 1 or 2 references. So we expect them to back up their statements by the most recent references. So that are you expecting from your unit or from your presentation? Thank you.
Right. Thank you, sir. So to your first question, sir, constipation, these retrorectal tumors, they usually present with non-specific symptoms and a wide area of symptoms because of the variety of lesions present there, because of the area where totipotential cells are present. So this constipation off and on for 1 year was precisely due to the growing size of the cyst. And your second question was, sir, the third part was about the references. So your point is well taken. The references should have been added earlier. So we in the last slide we added the references, so they could have been put at the precise place. What was your second question, sir, please?
Fecalith.
No, fecalith was not felt in the DRE. No, sir. There was only a bulge felt in the DRE about 2 centimeters, 1.5 to 2 centimeters from the anal wall, sir.
Okay, thank you.
May I request Professor Ajay Khanna, sir, to unmute himself and ask the question, sir?
Good morning, Seema. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, you are audible, sir.
Okay. No, just wanted to make a comment on the type of the fluid which was coming. We have ruled out the peritoneal fluid. We have ruled out the not from the urinary tract. But the third possibility in these type of the scenario is that is it coming from the spinal cord? Is it the cerebrospinal fluid which is coming out from there? Because the internal meningomyelocele is a known entity that rather than protruding outside, it is protruding inside there. And it can have a similar presentation that we are thinking that it is a tail cyst, but in fact, it is the internal meningocele which is there. And we have removed that. And now the cerebrospinal fluid is coming continuously from that. So I think we should if still it is coming, we should investigate this patient from that point of view.
Yes, sir. Yeah, that point came to our mind, sir, that could it be an interior meningomyelocele, which could present, the presentation would be similar. And when the fluid was coming, whether it was CSF or not. So again, we discussed it with our radiology consultants, Dr. Ishan and Dr. Ashish. So they said that it is not, and even peroperatively, there was no neural defect there. So it was peroperatively also, we did not think it was meningomyelocele, and there were no symptoms. But then if we have to do a workup for CSF, then beta-2 transferrin is the test that has to be done, which is a protein produced by the neuraminidase activity in the brain, and that is uniquely found in the CSF. But as this was ruled out by our radiology consultants also peroperatively, postoperatively, so we did not go for this beta-2 transferrin. But that is the test that has to be done, which is unique, uniquely found in the CSF, sir.
And also there is no symptomology like the postural headache and headache while changing the position of the patients. And although the MRI is the investigation of choice to rule out any defect, but we did the CT scan and discussed with the radiology people that there is no defect. So we rule out the meningoceles. And
the very typical,
but
yes,
still
as
it is
Dr.
coming,
Satinder, yes,
still the
yes.
fluid is coming. If still the fluid is coming, I will suggest that you should go for this test and also the MRI for this patient.
Okay,
Okay,
sir.
if it is still coming.
Okay, sir.
Okay. The second thing is, the radiologists have not told you that what is the location of this cyst, because that is the most important thing to tell by the radiologist. As your approach, surgical approach will be different. If the swelling is below the level of the S3, then you can go for the perineal approach. You can go for the what is the Kraske operation, which is there. You can carry out. And if it is above that, then you have to go for the abdominal approach. Either you go by the laparotomy or you do the laparoscopy. Both are feasible for that. But it has to be told by the radiologist that is it below L3 or it is S3 or it is above the S3.
Sir, he already told
Like in
it rises from the
above the
yeah. Rising upper limit of the cyst is S2. He has given a comment in the CT scan report.
Okay, so if it is S2 is there, then abdominal approach.
Yes.
If it is below S3 is there, then it is the perineal approach. And if it is occupying both components, means there's a big component which is there, perineal as well as the abdominal. So you have to go for the combined approach in these patients here.
And one comment, sir, if regarding the chyluria, if you suspect the chyluria, Dr. Vivek asked whether the workup done or not. The chyluria workup done only when the color fluid is become milky, and because of the lipid-rich secretions. And when we regarding workup of the chyluria, we should go for the fluid triglycerides level. It should be more than 200 milligram per dl.
Vivek, can you tell what is the most significant complication of operating in the retrorectal region?
Sir, injury to ureter.
That is not that you look for that, but something happens which you have to control right there. What is that in the rectal region?
Arterial injury, sir. Middle.
Not the arterial.
Sacral plexus.
Yes. Presacral veins which are there.
Yes.
That is the most torrential type of the thing which can happen at the time of the operation in the retrorectal region, and it is really very difficult to control. So you know how to control the bleeding from the presacral veins? because they retract inside the sacrum. So it is very difficult to control.
Pressure application, sir.
Yeah, just the packing. That is the only thing which is there. There are other things which are you can carry out. You cannot take a suture there. So you can put sometimes there's those blackboard pins which are there. They can be put inside. If you have the sterile blackboard clips, the pins which are there, blackboard pins which have a sharp end and then there's a blunt top is there.
Yes.
So that you can use for control of the pre-sacral bleeding. But otherwise, the only answer for that is packing. And sometimes you have to come out with the pack itself, and then you remove the pack after 24 to 48 hours. Okay.
And thank you, sir, for your valuable inputs and advice. Sir. So as it is 8:31 now, I thank Dr. Divya, Dr. Satyendra, and inputs from pathology, Dr. Paromita, Dr. Manish, Dr. Sameer Trivedi, Dr. Ishan, and Dr. Vaibhav for their valuable support. And now we move on to the medicine presentation. I invite Dr. Ankita Devangan, a resident who would be presenting from the medicine, and Dr. Nilesh and Dr. Jitendra would be moderating the case. So Dr. Ankita, please.
Let me introduce this. Good morning to all of you, respected director, sir, and respected teacher. On the behalf of Unit 5, we are going to present an interesting case of pyrexia pulmonale. This case carries various misleads in presentation and in diagnostic workup, but how a natural course of a disease can give a lead to make a diagnosis. So I request Dr. Ankita to present an interesting case from Unit 5.
Good morning, respected teachers, seniors, and dear colleagues. Today I'm going to present a case on Clinical Society meeting on the behalf of Unit 5 of Department of Medicine. My moderator of the presentation is Professor K.K. Gupta, Dr. Nilesh Kumar, Dr. Jitendra Sen. History. A 35-year-old female resident of Varanasi, nurse by occupation with no known comorbidities, presented with GIF complaints of fever for 15 days, dry cough for 5 days, shortness of breath for 3 days. History of presenting illness. Patient was apparently all right 15 days back, after which she developed a fever for 15 days, recorded up to 102 degree Fahrenheit, intermittent in nature, associated with rigor and evening rise temperature. Dry cough 5 days, multiple bouts without any diurnal variation, shortness of breath for 3 days, incidence in onset gradually progressive, initially on exertion, and gradually became dyspneic on routine activity. Negative history. There is no history suggestive of hemoptysis, burning micturition, joint pain, rashes, ear discharge, sore throat, chest pain, orthopnea, PND, pain in abdomen, jaundice, generalized body swelling, hematuria, epistaxis, melena, hematomesis, photosensitivity, recurrent oral ulcer, hair loss, loss of appetite, loss of weight. Past history. There was a past history of pulmonary tuberculosis 14 years back. For that, she took anti-tubercular drug for 6 months. There was a history of cholecystectomy in 2013. No history of diabetes mellitus, hypertension, COPD, asthma, cardiac or any chronic illness in the past. Personal history, patient consumed mixed diet, normal sleep-wake cycle, normal bowel and bladder habits. There was no history of any substance misuse, no history of any allergy, no history of any recent travel. Family history was non-contributory. The menstrual history and obstetric history were uneventful. On examination, patient was conscious, cooperative, oriented to time, place, and person with vitals of pulse rate 108 beats per minute regular rhythm, systolic blood pressure of 124 mm mercury and 80 diastolic 80 mm mercury in right arm supine position with postural drop. Respiratory rate was increased with 22 breaths per minute and temperature was increased with 100.2 degree Fahrenheit. She was maintaining saturation of 98% at room air. General examination was within normal limits. Systemic examination, CNS, CBS, and per abdomen examination was within normal limits. Since my history was confined to respiratory system, so on inspection, shape and symmetry of the chest was normal, trachea was centralized, upper respiratory tract reveals no abnormality, accessory muscles of respiration were working. There was an absence of fullness and flattening of the chest, bilateral chest wall. On palpation, trachea was centralized, chest expansion was bilaterally symmetrical, vocal trimmeters increased over the right memory area and left infrascapular area. On percussion, del percussion over right memory area and left infrascapular area. On auscultation, bronchial breath sounds heard over the right memory area and left infrascapular area with increased vocal resonance over the same areas. On the basis of history examination, we kept a differential diagnosis of pneumonia, reactivation of old pulmonary corks, and non-infective inflammatory diseases. On investigations, hemoglobin was 11 gram per deciliter with increased total leukocyte count 15,560 cells per microliter with 77% neutrophil and 17% lymphocyte and 3% eosinophil. Liver function test and renal function test was within normal limit. Urine routine microscopy suggestive of no RBC and WBC cast. Viral marker HIV1, HIV2, HBs, AG antigen and anti-HCV was non-reactive. COVID-19 RT-PCR was negative. Malarial antigen, typhoid IgM, IgG was non-reactive. CRP was elevated. ESR was also elevated. And serum procalcitonin was elevated to 20.5 nanogram per ml. Montox test was positive. ANA was positive with a titer of 1:80. Vasculitic panel, C-ANCA and P-ANCA was negative. Serum ACE level was negative, was within normal range with 32 unit per liter. So I would like to invite Dr. Sharon Bose for a description of chest X-ray and HRC thorax of the patient.
Good morning, everyone. So I will be describing the positive findings as we always have limited time in CSS. So this is chest X-ray, PA view on which we can see an ill-defined opacity in right middle lung field. Along with it, we also can see a ill-defined linear opacity in the left lower lung field with blunting of the left costophrenic angle. So maybe there is some minimal pleural effusion is there. So on the basis of on these X-ray findings, we advise CT scan, and the CT scan showed multifocal areas of consolidation or nodular opacities in bilateral lung fields. The largest one of them was located in the right upper lobe anterior segment, along with other multifocal opacities and nodular opacity in bilateral lung fields. Like in this area, we can also see some opacities here. And this linear band of atelectasis, which was seen also visible on chest X-ray. So on the basis of these chest or HRCT findings, we suggested the possibility of infective pathology with the differentials of bronchopneumonia and the second differential of some granulomatous infection like tuberculosis, histoplasma, or aspergillosis. And on the basis of this differential, we advise them to go for the further workup.
Thank you, boss. We have done a bronchoalveolar lavage. On routine microscopy, total cells was 831 with neutrophil 69% and leukocyte 28%. There was the presence of necrotic material. Acid pass bacilli stain, there was no acid pass bacilli seen. On gram stain, gram positive cocaine singles and small clusters seen. negative cocoa and gram-negative cocoa bacilli seen. On culture sensitivity, there was a growth of Pseudomonas aeruginosa sensitive to meropenem, piperacillin tazobactam, and levofloxacin. Malignant cytology was negative. Fungal culture was suggestive of no growth, and gene expert was negative. Serum galactomannan was negative. Blood culture was sterile. On the basis of history, examination, and obligatory investigation, we kept a differential diagnosis of bacterial pneumonia. However, we have kept in our back of mind, because of the presence of pulmonary nodule in HRCT thorax, we have done biopsy of that nodule also, but it came out to be a non-specific. Patient was started with empirical antibiotic treatment for bacterial pneumonia from day 1 of admission. Injection ceftriaxone tablet azithromycin was started, and other supportive management was given. Still, the patient was febrile after day 3 of antibiotic. Bronchoalveolar lavage was done at this point of time as sputum was non-productive. Blood culture was also sent. After report of BAL, antibiotics were upgraded to injection piperacillin and tazobactam, and other supportive management were continued. This is the graph showing the response in the form of temperature. Here we can see that the patient is having a persistent fever until at the end of discharge. This is the leukocyte count response, in which we can see that after the introduction of antibiotic from the day 7 of the illness, day 7 of the admission, the leukocyte counts tends to decrease and became normal at the end of discharge. Since after 14 days of antibiotic treatment, patient was still febrile with decreased spike of fever. Hence, with the background history of old pulmonary coughs and in her role as a healthcare worker, anti-tubercular drug was started on day 18 of admission, keeping the possibility of reactivation of coughs in Indian scenario. Anti-tubercular drug started as per the weight ban. Discharge. Due to increased number of COVID-19 cases in month of April 2021, patient was discharged on request with anti-tubercular drugs. Patient was kept in regular follow-up with temperature charting and routine investigation via telephonic conversation. This slide is showing the temperature charting, which is done by her own during her home stay. In this, we can see that the fever was persisted even after a discharge, and however, we were not able to admit the patient due to unavailability of inpatient facility in view of COVID-19 outbreak in month of April 2021. After availability of common inpatient facility, patient was again admitted in our unit after negative COVID-19 RT-PCR with complaints of fever for 2 months, shortness of breath for 7 days, and cough with expectoration for 3 days. Fever was intermittent in nature, and shortness of breath was aggravated on exertion, which relieved after taking rest. And it was also associated with chest discomfort and nasal stuffiness in this time. And cough with expectoration was also associated with one episode of hemoptysis. Patient was febrile with vitals of pulse rate 116 beats per minute regular rhythm, systolic blood pressure of 122 and diastolic blood pressure 80 mm mercury in right arm supine position with no borsal drop. Respiratory rate increased with 24 breaths per minute, and temperature was also increased with 102 degree Fahrenheit. She was maintaining saturation 92% on room air, and she was on nasal prong 90% saturation at 2 to 4 liter per minute. On general examination, pallor was present and other general examination were within normal limit. Systemic examination, CNS, CVS, and perabdominal examination were within normal limit. Respiratory system examination, on inspection, shape and symmetry of the chest was normal. Trachea was shifted to slightly right side. There was a use of accessory muscles of respiration, and restricted movement over the bilateral chest was present. On palpation, trachea was shifted slightly to right side. Chest expansion was diminished bilaterally. Vocal parameters increased over the right mammary area, left infrascapular and left infraaxillary area. On percussion, dull percussion over right mammary area, left infrascapular and left infraaxillary area. Auscultation, bronchial breath sounds heard over the right mammary area, left infrascapular and left infraaxillary area. Left-sided coarse crepes present in the basal regions. On investigations, hemoglobin 10.2 gram per deciliter with elevated total leukocyte count 23,280 cells per microliter with 81% neutrophil and 11% lymphocyte. The renal function test and liver function test were within normal limit. Urine routine microscopy was normal, and again viral marker COVID-19 RT-PCR was again negative, and rapid antigen for COVID-19 was negative. Now, since patient was presented with this time with a fever of 2 months, so we have done a workup in the line of PUO. In this, again, here ESR was elevated 89 mm at the end of first hour. Also elevated. Montus was positive. ANA was positive with a titer of 1:100. RA factor was positive with titer of 72.08 international unit per ml. Urine culture and blood culture was sterile. USG abdomen suggestive of normal study with no evidence of abdominal cause. Sputum gram stain suggestive of free gram, a few gram positive cocci seen in chains. Gram sputum culture sensitivity suggestive of no growth. Sputum fungal cultures, no fungal growth was present. Sputum AFB and GeneXpert was negative. Serum aspergillus antibody IgG IgM was negative, and serum galactomannan was positive with a titer of 1.091. Now I would like to invite further Dr. Sharun Bas for a description of chest X-ray and HRCT thorax of the patient.
Now, this scan was done approximately 2 months after the initial presentation of the patient, and this time the disease process is much more extensive. We can see there is a large patch of consolidation in right upper lung fields with a nice bronchogram going through this consolidation. Along with this, we can see an ill-defined opacity which is obscuring the right heart border, suggestive of some consolidation in right middle lung and middle lobe. Along with that, we have prominent opacity in the right hilar region and some opacity, ill-defined opacity in the right retrocardiac region. Here also we can see some bronchograms going through it. And along with that, we can also see multiple ill-defined opacities in bilateral lung fields, right as well as left. And also we can see there is a left-sided pleural effusion. So again, we did advise for the HRCT, and we can see that there is consolidation in anterior segment of right upper lobe, and there is consolidation in the right middle lobe, along with mild pleural effusion in left pleural cavity and consolidation in the medial basal segment of left lower lobe. And along with that, these consolidation, we also have some multi-segmental, multifocal consolidations, some in the subpleural region, some in peribronchovascular distribution. So there is a random distribution. And again, and also there was 1 centimeter subcranial lymph node. So again, this imaging picture is suggestive of infection. Infection is to be the etiology, most likely a bacterial infection. Second possibility is fungal infection, because these findings are non-specific. But the problem here is that our imaging morphology is suggestive of infective etiology, but all the workup they did, they didn't find any particular pathogen for to find the cause for that infective etiology. So if you are getting a radiological picture which is suggestive of infection, but the workup shows that there is no but the workup detect no pathogen, so we should raise the suspicion for small vessel vasculitis like Wegener's and microscopic polyangiitis and Churg-Strauss syndrome. So again, our radiological diagnosis, first radiological diagnosis is infective etiology, and second radiological diagnosis is small vessel vasculitis involving the pulmonary parenchyma.
So on the basis of history, examination and obligatory investigation, we kept as a provisional diagnosis of pyrexia of unknown origin caused probably pulmonary aspergillosis or non-infective inflammatory diseases. Initial management were done, and in this empirical antibiotic was started with injection meropenem, and antifungal was also started as injection voriconazole. Other supportive management continued. Now, during the course of illness in the hospital, patient developed redness of bilateral eyes, which is associated with pain, burning sensation over eyes, photophobia, and increased lacrimation and foreign body sensation. She also developed a fever, decreased hearing from left ear, which was painless, associated with oral fullness and ringing-like sensation in left ear. There was no history of any ear discharge or vertigo. She also developed a bilateral facial pain, nasal congestion, and multiple episodes of epistaxis. There was no history of any joint pain. On examination, bilateral eyes were congested, bilateral maxillary tenderness present, inferior turbinate hypertrophied over the bilateral nasal peel, and nasal septum was deviated towards the right side. Dini's test
Dr.
was
Ankita, excuse me, Dr. Ankita, kindly complete your presentation because you have taken 20 minutes, so we need 10 minutes for discussion, okay? How many slides are left?
Okay, ma'am, I'll complete.
Kindly wind up your presentation so that we can take up the questions, right?
Okay, ma'am.
Thank you.
Because of the symptoms, because of the development of new symptoms, we advise the patient for CT-PNS. In this, it was showed that there was a presence of bilateral maxillary sinusitis. So prolonged duration of a fever, which is refractory to antibiotics, pulmonary nodules, hemoptysis, bilateral congested eyes, left conductive hearing loss, tinnitus, epistaxis, nasal stuffiness, and facial pain. All these symptoms are pointing towards a disease which is something non-infectious but is inflammatory. So and primarily involving the upper respiratory tract. So we had a thought of ANCA-associated vasculitis. We have two types of disease in ANCA-associated vasculitis, Pechner's granulomatosis and microscopic polyangiitis. After that, we work up the patient for vasculitic panel, in which the C-ANCA was positive with a titer of more than 100 unit per ml. We revised the treatment in antifungal and antitubercular drug was stopped. Patient was started with immunosuppressive therapy for induction of remission. Patient was explained about the adverse effect of the immunosuppressive therapy. With written informed consent, patient was started with 50 mg prednisolone and 100 mg cyclophosphamide. And other conservative management was continued along with the calcium and vitamin D supplementation. Patient became febrile from day 3 of the oral cyclophosphamide and steroid. Her symptoms like red eye, oral fullness, tinnitus, dry cough, epistaxis, hearing loss, shortness of breath, and nasal stuffiness improved. Patient was discharged with oral cyclophosphamide and steroid and other medication. Patient was we can see that on the follow-up of immunosuppressive therapy, TLC count was decreased and ESR CRP was also became in the normal range at the end of 6 months. C-ANCA was also became in the normal range at the end of 6 months. This chest X-ray and HRCT thorax was suggestive of resolution of the primarily previously involvement lung parenchyma and also resolution of CT-PNS. Vaginous granulomatosis with vaginous granulomatosis, that is given the nomenclature as granulomatosis with polyangiitis, is a rare and autoimmune disorder characterized by necrotizing granulomatous vasculitis of upper and lower respiratory tract together with glomerulonephritis, affecting predominantly small to medium-sized vessels. American College of Rheumatology has established the following criteria. The presence of sensitivity, the presence of 2 or more of the 4 criteria was associated with an 88% sensitivity and 92% specificity. This is the treatment algorithm of ANCA-associated vasculitis. So the take-home message of my presentation is, if there is a presence of active urine sediment, sputum smear consistently negative for acid-fast bacilli and prominent ENT symptoms, we should be very alert to the presence of granulomatosis polyangiitis.
Okay, thank you, Ankita, for a nice presentation. Just an observation, Ankita, that whenever there is a continuum of symptoms, so if like X-ray, you could have placed all the 3 X-rays simultaneously on one slide, or the CT scan films, that could give a nice this to the viewer how the changes have taken place in over the course of period. So now I invite questions. So I would request Dr. Anand Kumar to kindly unmute himself and ask his question. And Dr. Nilesh to take over.
Good morning. This is from for resident. Means all your history and examination finding is confined to the chest or pulmonary symptoms only. So why you order for the hepatitis C or hepatitis B investigation? Although the twice, first time also and the second admission also.
Sir, first of all, we usually do as a routine workup for hepatitis B and hepatitis C, sir.
Okay, so this is your routine protocol. Okay. So second question is that although both time the ANA was positive, so why not it was suspected in the first admission itself that this is a non-infectious inflammatory condition, because it was there in your differential in the first admission itself. And what is the significance of serum galactomannan after piperacillin and tazobactam, as you have already introduced it, and that was the only reason to suspect the fungal infection, nothing other than that suggestive of fungal infection.
Yes, sir.
Let me answer. There are three queries by Dr. Anand. Thank you. First one, why we are asked for hepatitis B and hepatitis C virus detection, because we are suspecting vasculitis, and the treatment response and treatment outcome, we have to see whether the hepatitis B or hepatitis C activity was there. Suppose in case of vasculitis, if we are using the cyclophosphamide or rituximab as a induction chemotherapy, they may exacerbate the symptom of the hepatitis B and hepatitis C. And your second question is galactomannan. Why we did the galactomannan when we already given the piperacillin tazobactam? In our first instance, the galactomannan positivity was there, but it termed as a false positive, and we did not start the voriconazole in our first instance. When the patient admitted after 2 months, the symptomatology is exacerbated, and even if radiologist put the diagnosis of invasive fungal infection, whether it is a invasive aspergillosis or histoplasmosis, then we send the galactomannan in second instance, but there is no fungal growth observed on the microscopy or in the culture. We had given already the anti-tubercular drug. We had already covered the broad spectrum antibiotic. Then we have only the option that there is a galactomannan is present, and we started the voriconazole therapy. Third question.
Dr. Seema, can I ask a question? Dr. Ashok Kumar.
Yes, sir. Please, sir.
Yes, quite interesting case. I am concerned about the dose of paracetamol. The resident mentioned that she advised or the patient was given 1 gram SOS. Is it the usual dose in adults, the paracetamol?
Yes, sir. We can give a 1 gram paracetamol 8 hourly, sir. In
Is it the usual dose, or you start with 1 gram, or you can start with a lower dose?
Sir, in adult, we usually prescribe 650 milligram twice daily, but we can increase up to the 4 gram. As the patient is not responding to the usual dose of antipyretic, then we have to upgrade the dose of paracetamol.
Okay, and may I know the name of the radiology resident? The name, she can tell.
Just the name, sir is asking.
Dr. Mohammed Sharun.
But I think you used the medicine resident used the word boss. Did you use the word boss in presentation?
Yes, she did.
Why? This is a very serious meeting, very formal meeting. And 3 or 4 times I thought he is a BOSE. So initially I got confused. So that's why I asked this question. See, one has to be very, very careful in formal meetings. You have to maintain all the etiquettes and decor. The number of slides were too many. So the unit should have done the homework properly. You can't teach us. This is not a seminar on vasculitis. So you should have restricted the number of slides to 20 minutes. Then the discussion would have taken place, right? So that's my message to the unit consultants also. I mean, they have to see the slides, the number of slides. It should not be left to resident doctor alone to decide the number of slides. So there should have been normally, but we do in pediatrics, there should be departmental presentation followed by clinical society meeting presentation. So that's why the presentation is always better. That's my comment. Thank you very much.
So may I invite the last question? Dr. Rahul Khanna may unmute himself and ask the question.
It was actually a well worked up case, and well done, Dr. Nilesh. But one thing I noticed that in the workup, that we did not have the benefit of a tissue diagnosis at any point. And because it was pointed out that there was a subcarinal lymph node present, and this lymph node is frequently very important and significant in the diagnostic workup, because when all the diagnoses were being eliminated, it came to my mind that it could be a sarcoidosis also. And this lymph node biopsy would have been very meaningful, and including for the ultimate diagnosis of vasculitis, lymph node biopsy would have been very contributory. Of course, taking out the subcarinal lymph node
Excuse me,
sampling is
it's
difficult.
9 o'clock. Dr. Nilesh may quickly answer that question. We are
But
finishing.
there is a
the time.
possibility of doing a transbronchial needle biopsy of a subcarinal lymph node. Can you approach the transbronchial route? Thank
Dr.
you, Dr.
Nilesh may quickly answer.
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. As this is a case of pyrexia of unknown origin, but if there is a bilateral hilar lymphadenopathy was present, then we suspect whether we are dealing with a case of sarcoidosis. But we did the ACE level to rule out whether the supportive evidence whether it is a case of sarcoidosis. We plan for the tissue biopsy. Actually, vasculitis is a diagnosis of tissue biopsy, a definitive diagnosis, and other parameters are only supportive. But patient was refused for any invasive procedure, and for the cranial or paratracheal lymphadenopathy, we have to go through the endoscopic bronchial ultrasound, which is that facility is not available to our side. If we did the tissue biopsy, then we are able to make a confirmatory diagnosis whether we are dealing with a particular case of vasculitis. But higher level of ANCA positivity and prolonged pyrexia and then hemoptysis and supportive evidence of ENT symptom lead to the diagnosis of GPA, granulomatous polyangiitis.
Thank you, Dr. Nilesh. With this, we come to an end, and I would, in the end, invite our esteemed director, Sir Professor Mittal, to give his expert comments regarding the presentation today.
Thank you, Professor Seema.
Thank you.
Both the cases well presented, well worked out. First case, surgical. It's good presentation. Only thing I found, if I'm not wrong, proctoscopy findings were presented before the systemic examination. So I think systemic examination is always first, then this proctoscopy and all. Otherwise, good discussion, good case, good surgery. And second case already discussed. It's a good case for presentation and discussion, but history and examination at both the admissions was discussed at length. That's why a lot of time it took. And radiological also, as you had mentioned, side by side, the cuts or images could have been presented. But overall, good case to learn lot many things. Even sarcoidosis should have been kept in mind, as Professor Rao told. Though EBUS, if it is not available facility, in the academic discussion could have been discussed that this histopathological diagnosis, tissue diagnosis, we could have done this, but because of unavailability of the such facility here, we could not do it. And if sarcoidosis any time comes to mind, even ACE levels could have been done. Sarcoidosis is one of the commonest diagnoses I have seen for fever and all these mimicking this tuberculosis, and it's quite common. But overall vasculitis another common, though it was diagnosed late because patient was having fever. But overall good discussion we could not have much, but good presentation, nice case. But definitely in the unit, the resident should first see the slides, number of slides. These presentation are also to learn how to present. It's not only that the material, how to present within the allotted time. That is also art and to learn. So though this has been done, but in future also, so residents learn from this. That's why these forms are very, very important. Overall good cases. Congratulations to both the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for your to-the-point comments. And thank you, esteemed faculty and dear students, for today's presentation. Thank you all.
sarcoidosis हम लोगों ने किया बोला था मैंने।
हाँ वो बोल रहा था वो और सैचुरेशन सिम्टम्स नहीं थे ना, इसलिए हमने उसको हाँ ये सरकार बारी के सेंटर के प्राइवेट के लिए सोचे
इसके लिए तो हमने इस लेवल
हम सोचे कि ये स्लिप भी करा लिया और सिम्टम्स नहीं है। हाँ
वही 2 मिनट पहले खत्म कर लेते हैं। क्वेश्चन और आए तो नहीं डालता।